We're talking about the just concluded National Conference on Education that took place in a bid to rededicate its efforts in improving education and ensuring that all children are afforded an equal opportunity to learn. To debrief us on the just ended summit, we're now joined this evening by the Ministry of Education, Arts and Culture, Executive Director Sanet Steenkamp, and as well as the educational specialist, Patrick Sam. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome. Lovely having you here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nina.
Thank you so much for being here. Ms. Steenkamp, let's start with you. Now, the just concluded summit focused on, a wide array of discussions that were centered around the recommitment towards education. Would you say that it lived up to its expectations? And when we speak of recommitment, what exactly are we speaking of?
Absolutely. I would definitely say that that which we have looked forward to achieve in terms of the conference over a 4-day period, definitely we had, it's more than just a recommitment, it's about a transformation. Doing things differently, rethinking, reimagining education, changing the way we learn, we strategize, changing the way we implement. So with 649 delegates in presence, and then more than 2,868 who joined us online, it was just absolutely amazing. The level, the depth of the discussions, for me, it shows that we are really living in a democratic country, and people were willing to put their necks out there and provide constructive criticism, but also the solutions that we know we can have within ourselves in the education system. So it really looked at what can we do differently with what we have. How do we look at existing structures or existing strategies? Should we strengthen them? Should we totally unpack them? One of the key issues that we specifically paid also close attention to is the issue of education financing and resource mobilization. So we will, of course, talk a little bit more about that later, but definitely we are delighted and we are very humbled as a country that we were joined also internationally across Africa and beyond. People showed great interest in our conference.
All right. Patrick, on to you. Do you think, or would you say that the current education system, is cognizant of the various changes that the world has undergone, firstly, and secondly, have they been able to meet these changes?
Okay. I think that's very interesting, taking from Sanet's point and you putting it into the global context, because the theme was also, as it's written here, transforming education towards inclusion and quality in the context of the global challenge. Now, we are here today. We know we want to be there. There's a gap. There's $168 billion globally missing from financing and resourcing this engine of education, right? So when we talk about what was unique about this conference is that for the first time, the assumption of the provision of quality education is a shared responsibility was really emphasized, right? So what does that mean, Nina, differently? A lot of the times, the way the government is designed is to say, Ministry of Transport, you're in charge of transport, or Works, you're in charge of Works. Ministry of Education, you're in charge of education.
Right.
But the reality is that the provision of education also entangles into other people's mandates, like there's a working issue.
Correct.
There's a road problem at some of the schools. Are they feeder schools? We're talking about digital transformation, but is there electricity?
Right.
Remember, there's 1,945 schools in the country. And so for the first time, given the global context of transforming education, here's the difference. A lot of the times in Namibia, we say, Ministry of Education, it's your baby, make sure everybody's educated.
Yeah.
For the first time, the Namibian government is saying the government is responsible, not the ministry, for the transformation. Therefore, it was not a conference to discuss education reforms, because the reforms would come purely from the ministry itself. Right now, the stakes were raised to say that whatever reform which now becomes a transformation, because the commitment is no longer just on the Ministry of Education, but that responsibility gets shared now throughout government.
Right.
So whether it is regional councils that are important, whether it's with land that needs to be provided for some schools where you just can't expand anymore and add classrooms. So where does that happen? Traditional authorities that kind of set the cultural value for education were invited. But what's most important is that the stakes were changed and the Namibian government acknowledged that it's not just the ministry that's responsible for the provision of education, but it is the entire government, including state-owned enterprises.
Very, very valid points that you've raised there, Patrick. Outside of this holistic approach to the reimagination of the education system, what else do you think needs to be done in order for us, to keep up with the times and the changing of times?
But I think the ministry has come up with those transformational actions, Annette.
Absolutely.
Please tell us about it.
So there are 4. But I must say that before this conference, we already, and Patrick was such an integral part of that, also leading the facilitation of the discussions. We had 14 regional consultations where we garnered and got the voices also from the youth, which is very, very important to us, traditional authorities and all the key stakeholders and role players. So there are 4 things that stood out. We realized that, and it came out over and over, first and foremost, we need to have a numeracy and literacy drive, starting from pre-grade, grade 1, 2, and 3.
Right,
Every
right.
teacher must be able to assess a learner, with an assessment and to see where are the gaps in what needs to be done. Because we still find, and it is the learning crisis is globally, it's not just in Namibia. A grade 4 child, a 10-year-old, should be able to at least read 40 words per minute correctly in the mother tongue that is offered. So we need to strengthen our diagnostic tools for literacy numeracy. That's one. The second issue that we need to focus on is the transformation, the organizational development, the structures that are established within government, in the public sector, headquarters and the regions. How do we streamline them? How do we make sure that they are now talking and addressing and are responsive to the needs that we have in terms of ICT, for example, equally? The third thing is the most important one. I mean, all of them are important, but transformation of the teachers. The teacher, the teaching in the classroom, and also the teacher profession.
Correct.
So there was a strong call for us to expedite the regulatory body for teachers, the teachers' professional regulatory body, which talks about the standards, but also the employment, the licensing, the performance agreements of teachers. So that is something that stood out because, as Patrick said, the theme was built around inclusivity and quality. It's not just about access after 32 years now. Now is time to really focus on what happens in the classroom and is it of real quality.
Yes.
And the fourth one that I mentioned much earlier was, how do we mobilize domestic resources?
Right.
How do we have a shared model of financing that I know that the parent will know exactly what his or her obligations are and responsibilities, and will be held accountable then for that, to invest in the child. I said at the conference, it's the best gift a parent can give is the gift of investment in education. And it's the best gift that government can give. And Patrick said it so well, is to invest, which is done in our country. We have the political will. So, but how do we then make sure that the under-resourced schools, the under-resourced institutions of higher learning, the universities, we have now to do so much more with, a resource envelope that isn't so big anymore and as thick as it used to be. So those are the 4 key things that came out and which we have now to unpack into strategies, into our national development plans for the next 7 years.
Thank you.
From 2023 to 2030.
Edie, the last education conference, National Education Conference, was in 2011. That's almost roughly 11 years ago. And of course, there were targets placed at that conference as well. And I'm sure you had a look back as well as in terms of how far you've come. And were those targets successfully met over the past plus minus 11 years?
Absolutely, majority of them. The first biggest one was the reform that Patrick also talked about, the reform of the curriculum as a measure. It's absolutely important. We did that. We reformed the curriculum. It took us 7 to 8 years to do that. We just finished with AS last year and writing our first exams. Then, of course, you also have the issue of the reintroduction of technical or pre-vocational subjects. We can say with pride today that for children with disabilities, children in our resource school, we now have a recognized level 1 certificate on basic pre-voc subjects. Equally, we are increasing the funding for children with disabilities in our system. We've got the sector for inclusive, various policies were drawn up. We looked into the issue of life skills, for sure. The one issue that we did not discuss at this conference, but which is still topical, was the issue of shebeens. We still didn't get that right as a country. To say that the issue that was in 2011 is still an elephant in the room, and that is ownership around shebeens, and the political will, and also the community ownership to address issues of drugs and alcohol, you know, in a community setting, and the operations of shebeens. So I think there's still much more that needs to be done. The universal primary education and the universal secondary education, Namibia is held internationally, that we also provide grant funding to schools at a secondary level. Our budget at this very moment stands at 182 million for schools that we grant, but schools remain undersourced.
Yeah.
And that is why we have to find a new way of coming up with solutions, and the private sector do play a role. So yes, we have done a great number of the recommendations have been attended to.
Yeah.
And I think now we are ready to run with what we've agreed on.
Right. Thank you. Just as we're rounding off our discussion, and Patrick, let's start with you. Overall, what do you hope, you know, the just ended summit, education summit, will bring about, you know, in the near future?
Well, I think from an education perspective, there is a need in terms of the system. So currently, for instance, at the ECD level, per capita per child, we're investing, excuse me, $294 per child. At a higher...
That is per annum?
Yeah.
Yes.
At a higher tertiary education level, we're investing $56,564. At a secondary level, it's $16,607. At a primary level, it's $15,990. So, and then at a pre-primary, it's $4,037. So the point is, we start very low and increase the investment. But in many countries where it works, it's the other way around.
Exactly.
You put the most amount of money at the foundation,
Right.
and it decreases as you go up from
As
a
you go
public
up.
investment perspective.
Right.
So the public needs to know that the modality works like that, and therefore when we advocate, even from a political point of view, whether it's talking about investment and where the parties that we support, where must they put the money, or where the government must appropriate it, the system needs to acknowledge that the greatest investment, if you want, the returns on, I think it is for every $1 in 17 return.
Oh, wow.
So for every $1 that you
That you
invest
invest.
more at an ECD level, there's $17 that comes in return from ensuring that individuals
Right.
cognitive ability that is developed or through the education system. So that could be part of the problem, that we wait too long to invest in our human resources. And I think that might be with what I was speaking about with the arts and culture plays a role. I said that and I speak as the chairperson of the Art Council, is that you can't say that our children have dignity unless they are exposed to the arts, culture, and heritage. It is almost like a litmus test for how dignified are you, right?
Yeah.
And if that continues on the periphery, that means that we don't understand human dignity and how human development takes place when people don't have a sense of belonging, don't have a voice of power to speak from. So I think this idea to take away of outsourcing what we call education is irresponsible at a family level, it's irresponsible at a community level, it's irresponsible sometimes at a government level. What we need to do is at all of those levels ensure that not just schooling is what leads to education, but that schooling is part of the package, but education is also strengthened at a household level in terms of our time, in terms of our skill, and in terms of our money.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Edie, final remarks from you, just briefly, please.
Well, I just want to thank the Namibian nation for supporting us all the way. And really, we are ready to go back into the regions to further unpack what fee-free education means. We've started with that. We will now do a huge advocacy around that, and also we will share the report, and the outcomes of the consultations will be used to put together the position paper for His Excellency to present in New York, September 2022.
Edie and Mr. Patrick Sam, thank you so much for your time. It was absolutely lovely having you here this evening.
Thank you,
Pleasure.
Nina.